So our next speaker is Jessica Few. Jess studied physics at Durham and graduated with a master's in 2013. She then worked for 3 years at the National Physical Laboratory, NPL, and she joined LoLo and UCL in 2016. Her PhD is focused on ventilation in occupied homes, and she'll, when she's submitted, which she's just about to do, she'll be joining the Energy Institute as Research Fellow in January. Jess, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Cliff. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Jessica Few, and my PhD is focused on ventilation in occupied homes. So today I'm just going to talk about the ventilation system that was installed in the case study homes that I monitored as a kind of manageable thing to discuss in this amount of time. So I'm going to give a brief kind of overview of the context and content of my PhD, and then I'm going to talk about how the ventilation system in my case study homes was supposed to work. I'm then going to talk about the ventilation rates, the trickle vents, and the effect of cleaning the ventilation inlets in my case study homes. And then I'm going to talk briefly about some implications of this aspect of the work. So we all probably know that homes have become more airtight in recent years to reduce unplanned ventilation and associated heat loss. But good indoor air quality is required for good health, and adequate ventilation rates are required for good indoor air quality. So the building regulations in the UK require means for adequate ventilation in newly built homes, and approved document F sets out the systems which are assumed to achieve that. But there's been relatively little detailed research on whether those ventilation systems actually perform as kind of intended in occupied homes. So my PhD was looking at, there was kind of 3 strands. So one of the problems with doing detailed ventilation measurement research in occupied homes is that commonly used ventilation measurement methods often either average over extended periods of time or are used to take a small number of snapshot measurements. Neither of these are necessarily that satisfactory because ventilation rates are highly variable and they depend on building characteristics, occupant actions, and weather conditions. So my PhD, the first part was to develop a measurement method for ventilation rates in occupied homes. This was based on the CO2 decay technique, and it combined an occupancy algorithm with another algorithm to identify appropriate periods of data to analyze. And then the second part was applying that method in 4 occupied homes over 6 months. And that resulted in over 500 ventilation measurement results in various different configurations of doors, windows, and weather conditions. The final part of the work looked at the kind of actions that ADF implies that occupants will take if the system is going to work as described. And I used a social practice theory framework to compare ADF's intentions with the occupants' practices. So that's a broad overview of the whole PhD. I'm just going to talk about the ventilation system in the occupied homes I studied. Okay, so the ventilation system in the homes I studied was a centralized continuous mechanical extract ventilation system, which means that there was a, so I'm just going to put my pointer on, there was a central fan which was connected to the to ventilation inlets in the bathroom, kitchen, and utility rooms, and then this was ducted to the outside. So replacement air was supposed to be drawn in through infiltration and through trickle vents above the windows, which were supposed to be continually open. So the ventilation system was supposed to provide a low flow rate most of the time, and then a high flow rate was supposed to be triggered in certain situations. So when I went to measure the flow rates through the system, so ADF gives extract rates that are supposed to be achieved during the low flow and boost flow conditions. So the low flow rate is supposed to be 13 litres per second, which in the flat I'm going to talk about converts to 0.55 air changes per hour. And then the high flow rate, the boost flow, was supposed to be different in each of the rooms indicated in these rows here. So when I measured the flow rates through the system, the first interesting thing to note was that there was no boost flow condition. So these flow rates were delivered continuously in the flat, which means that the total continuous flow rate was actually quite high. It was about 25 litres per second. So naively, you would kind of expect that the whole dwelling ventilation rate would be kind of similar to this value. But when I actually measured the ventilation rate, the whole dwelling ventilation rate using the CO2 degays, the median I measured was about 10 litres per second. So that's much, much lower than the flow rates through the ventilation system would imply. So we're not completely sure about the reason for this. One of the kind of plausible reasons is that it could be due to short circuiting. So either the air that is drawn into the ventilation system leaks out before it is extracted to outdoors, or the ventilation outlet could be close to a ventilation inlet such that the extracted air comes almost immediately straight back into the house. Either way, I think this is kind of a cautionary tale about trusting fan flow measurement results too much. The second thing I want to talk about is the trickle vents in the homes. So approved document F requires about 2,500 millimeters squared of trickle ventilation area. And these two flats I'm talking about now were provided with 4 times that value, at least that was what was labeled in the flat. But when we actually measured the ventilation area using a blower door test, the actual kind of area of the trickle vents when you open and close them was about 10 to 20% of the labeled area and less than the ADF required amount of area. So we don't know exactly why this is. I expect that everyone here looks inside trickle vents as often as I do. So you'll know that they're often really dusty inside. I personally think it'd be really interesting to do some research looking at the effect of cleaning trickle vents on the kind of flow through them. But I didn't do this for my PhD. The second thing to note about the trickle vents was that they were always closed. So I visited the flats 6 to 7 occasions over 6 months, and they were always closed on all of those occasions. There's not loads of literature about trickle vents, but what there is suggests that closed vents is actually quite common. The final thing I want to talk about is the effective cleaning of ventilation inlets. So one of my participants had noticed that this kind of area on one of his vents in the bathroom had kind of built up a kind of dusty residue. So I measured the flow rate and then he asked to borrow my steps so he could clean it away. And after cleaning, the flow rate through that inlet more than doubled. So these flats are about 4 years old at this point. I'm going to talk about some of the implications of the things I've just discussed. So for academia, I think with any of this work, you could kind of say, this is just 4 flats, so what's the big deal? But I think the problem is this kind of really detailed investigation of ventilation in occupied homes is really unusual, and kind of a more broad brush approach would find it quite hard to identify any of the issues I've just talked about. The second thing is about there needs to be more research into maintenance of ventilation systems. So none of my other participants were aware that maintenance of the ventilation system might be required. And I'm aware of almost no other research that looks at maintenance of ventilation systems. I know it's not really a glamorous area, but I do think it's really important that we are actually providing adequate ventilation rates over time in newly built homes, in all homes really. Okay, and then for industry, I think again, designing all ventilation systems so that they are easily maintained will be a good thing to do. And also I mentioned a concern about short circuiting. So this comes down to installing ventilation systems kind of as planned. And then for policy, I think just a greater attention to performance of ventilation systems in homes as occupied. So I've raised issues with mechanical extract ventilation, with trickle vents, and with maintenance. And with all of these things, I think if those technologies are going to remain a core component of domestic ventilation systems, it's really important that they perform as planned. Again, I think there will be implications to policy of this maintenance issue, but I think without doing more research, it's kind of hard to say exactly what form that should take. And the final thing is just comes down to more robust commissioning. So I mentioned this problem with short circuiting of the ventilation system, and with using kind of fan flow rates as indicating that adequate ventilation system has been installed. So that's all that I wanted to say. If there's time for any questions, I'm happy to take any.